Okay. All right. I thought we could start at the very beginning, as it were, before you started working at the New Yorker
Hmm.
and involved here. What do you remember the first time you met Thurber?
I don't remember the very first time, but I saw a lot of him when my mother and stepfather were first married, and they were living had an apartment down on 8th Street, and Jim Thurber was around a lot. He and Andy White, E.B. White, were close friends, and I was about 9 or 10 years old, and he was vivid company. I mean, he was cheerful and funny, and was the kind of person that a young boy remembered.
Can you describe him physically?
Well, he seemed to be flying apart all the time. He was lanky and he moved quickly, and he was he had that weird, strange look, his one eye flying off in direction, and what was that very strange look about his mouth, that little chin that came down to not very much, and the active, not very attractive mouth, but saying funny things. The Whites, after a while, added on to their apartment on East 8th Street and put in a ping pong table, and there was a lot of wild ping pong going on there, which Thurber was a major player, and I can still see him whanging at balls and diving around the table, and it was exciting stuff. And he was very pleasing. I hadn't seen anybody like that, and he brought out the boy and Andy White. So they were both in their they were both around 40, I guess, at the time, but they seemed a lot younger, and they laughed a lot, and there was a lot of laughter and cheerful grown-ups in a very relaxed atmosphere. It was very pleasing, funny stuff.
They shared the same office, I understand, at the old offices.
Yeah, I don't remember the office, but I know that they did. Yes, I remember that. But I remember him in the office too, and I remember, of course, seeing the drawings on the walls. And I never checked out the room. Or there was a story that at one point there was a telephone booth in the office. One of those you had a public phone. He brought in a whole booth, and I remember being told that he once took the booth and laid out flat and powdered his face and laid down in the telephone booth as if it was a coffin. But whether it's true or not, I don't know. But it's so strange to think of the youthful and relaxed and exuberant days of the early New Yorker, when everybody was young. It was a new magazine, and just every new issue was an invention, and people drawing on the walls, as Jim did. I mean, other people did as well, but he was the one who did these wild drawings, and you see them here and there in different offices and on the hall. And then when they moved from 45th Street to 44th Street, this went on. And some of those drawings, as you may know, remained, and there was one office which had been his office. They never painted over that particular set of drawings. And when we moved out of there 5 years ago in the late 80s, the decision was made to take the wall drawings, that they had become sacred objects, and the building where we're at 25 West 43rd suddenly realized this was a valuable object. The Thurber drawings were valuable, and the building tried to keep it. They said, these belong to us. These are our walls, and didn't succeed. But in some way, the walls were taken off and moved over to this new office, and you can see them downstairs. They're like a museum piece, and it's sort of sad to me. Excuse me. It feels a little frozen in what had been just an exuberant morning gesture to do something funny on the walls has become a museum piece now, and almost an icon of some sort.
Did you ever actually see him draw?
I don't think so. Well, actually, I think I did. Yeah, I guess I did once, because I interviewed him when I was in school. I was the editor of the school paper, and I interviewed him for the school paper. I was trying out for the school paper, I guess, and sat down with him at the Algonquin and talked to him. He had breakfast, and I interviewed him, and then he did a drawing of himself that he gave to me that ran in the school paper. So I remember that. It was a very good drawing, very accurate.
I understand he gave you once a drawing at boarding school, a famous drawing. Can you describe?
Well, my mother, I think, as a Christmas present or a birthday present, gave me, I think it was, in fact, I'm almost positive, it was the What Have You Done with Dr. Milmoss, the animal, the huge indescribable animal, and that somebody's hat there, and the woman saying, "What have you done with Dr. Milmoss?" And I took that. Can't remember if it was framed, but I had it at Pomfret School where I was going to school, and then one day it wasn't there, and somebody had made off with it. I don't believe it's floating around somewhere. My guess always was it was just some destructive prank where somebody took the drawing and threw it away. But it's too bad because it was one of his best, as you know.
Did he read?
Can you stop this?
It would change it.
Wait for the siren. Okay.
Dorothy.
Yeah.
He did my
Days if I can. I remember Thurber away from the office too. He used to, the Whites had a place up in Bedford, a summer place, and he used to visit them there. And I think I remember being up in Connecticut with Jim and Althea. I remember his famous Scotty, Jeannie, and who I think was the mother of the Scotty dog that the Whites had, named Daisy. So there was that connection. And I remember his being around dogs, and nothing in particular, but it wasn't just around in an office scene or here in New York.
Did the Whites and Thurber maintain contact after they moved up to Maine?
Well, they didn't. I think that the distance was difficult for them. They wrote back and forth, and then I think that Andy White and Jim drifted apart. It wasn't any particular thing, but I think that Andy was a little turned off by Jim's yearning for fame, his really open lust for fame, to be well known, to be a famous writer, which was very something that Andy White couldn't accept with equanimity, because his instincts all went the other way. He was a very private, very quiet person. This wasn't a technique that he decided on. It wasn't a technique to be a kind of a writer. Andy White just naturally was very shy and didn't like to be interviewed, never spoke in public. And he had strong feelings that a writer should be known by his work, and that he was damaged if people had some other idea about him rather than what they read or saw. And so I think this pushed them apart a little bit.
What about the Thurber's the years with Ross? I understand the Whites weren't very pleased.
They didn't like the book. They felt it was egocentric. They felt it was Thurber not at his best, and Thurber, it basically wasn't really sympathetic to Ross, and certainly I had that feeling myself. I felt that this was, the basic tone of it was how I used all my genius to save the New Yorker from the fool who had founded it. It was the tone that ran all the way through it, unfortunately. And I know that my mother, for instance, Catherine White, she was a fierce defender, loyal, extremely loyal to Thurber, to Harold Ross, and felt that it demeaned him and got him wrong.
Can you describe Harold Ross, your memories of him?
Well, sure. I mean, he was busy, preoccupied, strange-looking, cordial. Once I began to write for the New Yorker a little bit, he treated me with a certain amount of extra interest. But I enjoyed him. I admired him. I knew what he was, and he was always preoccupied. His hands full of galleys and papers, and on his way to see somebody else, and harassed by the demands of a weekly. But I didn't have any intimate doings with him. I had lunch with him once. I remember that very well, and he decided, since I was a contributor, to take me out to lunch. We sat at the Algonquin, and Hemingway was in town. This was long before the Lillian Ross piece about Hemingway. Hemingway was in town, and Ross said, "What about this Hemingway? Is he any good?" And I laughed, because Hemingway was the best-known American writer. He was the numero uno, somebody we all were in awe of. But it was a strange thing, because afterwards, I said to myself, "Is he any good?" This was the right editor's question. Don't take anything for granted, and it's very much like Ross to do that. It was a natural thing to say, "What about this guy? What about this guy? Is he any good? Is he any good?" It's to try to arrive at a private conclusion. And he said, I read that book of his about the First World War. What was it called? And I said, Farewell to Arms. He said, yeah. He said, I read that one. He said, I was in that war. He said, it wasn't anything like that. He said, this fellow just walked away from the war whenever he wanted to. He said, you couldn't do that.
You had mentioned that you think he kind of created this image of the country bumpkin or country boy image, and that actually made him a better editor.
Well, I think it was an essential assumption. It wasn't an image. It wasn't for the rest of the world. It was for himself. He constantly said, every day, his attitude was, I'm just a country boy. The famous questions that Ross would write on him. If you had something in print, in my case, I started off writing short stories, and it would come back and there would be 20 or 15 or 20 or 25 questions on the margins. One, and your editor, in my case, Gus Lebrano, he and I would go over the questions. And most of them were so foolish, and the answer was so clear that the question was pointless, and you would laugh at this. No, never mind, forget this. And then the 5th or 6th or 10th question, you would say, how could I have been so stupid? How could I have been so stupid? Of course he's right, and you would change something. That's a great editor.
And why do you think Ross and Thurber loved Ross so much?
Because Ross always paid the writer the ultimate compliment. He was extremely appreciative of his work. He never took anything for granted, and then he wanted more. He constantly said, "Give me more." And he would say to writers, "Why are you out here in the hall? Why aren't you in your office writing?" He wanted writers to write all the time, and he worried when they took any time off, even for lunch. His dream was every writer would be sitting at his typewriter all day long, and the floods of wonderful stuff would come out. But this is every writer works in deep doubt and discouragement, and this is what you want to hear, that the editor knows how hard it is and that he wants more for you, and that you're doing great.
Does it surprise you that Andy White and Thurber did not really hang out with the Algonquin lunch crowd?
No, they weren't like that at all. That was a very self-conscious group, and very, very much out of the theater rather than out of the literary or the journalistic group. They had FPA, who was a journalist, but it was. I think that the current view of it is more of the Algonquin crowd is more accurate than it used to be. I don't think they were all that funny, and there was a biting and unpleasant side to their humor.
Now, you had the kind of dubious distinction of inheriting being one of Thurber's editors after, I guess, Maxwell. Can you describe a little?
I think Maxwell had been the previous one. I came to the New Yorker as an editor in 1956. I was in my 30s, and I'd been an editor at Holiday magazine for years, and I've been a contributor to the New Yorker since my early 20s. But there was no thought of my coming to work here because the Whites were still here. My mother and stepfather were still here. I didn't want to work while they were here at work at the New Yorker, and it was fun. But then my mother announced she was leaving, and shortly after that, Sean asked if I would like to come to work at the magazine. And one of the first, I came to work in the fiction department, where I still am. One of the first people I was given, an author I was given, was Thurber, and I was stunned with happiness how they trust me with somebody as famous and important as this. But of course, I realized very quickly that the reason that I got him is that nobody wanted to touch him at this point, because he was extremely unpleasant. It was late in his life, and he was blind. He was not writing well, and he was alcoholic. He was suspicious. He was harsh, hard to get along with, and I think it was a big shock to him to have his work edited by me, because he'd known me as a kid years before, and while he was always friendly in a way to me. He called me Roger. I called him Jim. We went back a long way, but here I was, this young new editor at the New Yorker, handling James Thurber. He didn't like it.
And he, I guess, accused the whole staff of conspiring against him in some way. Do you remember some of those?
I don't remember. I think he must have verged on saying there was sort of a conspiracy, but of course it wasn't. There wasn't any such thing. Everybody wanted to publish him and wanted him to write well, but he was old and he was not writing well. And we turned down a lot of his stuff, which just about killed him. And I don't blame him. I was very sorry for him in retrospect. It was a very tough position. And to his credit, he kept on writing. He never stopped writing, and he would get these rebuffs, which for a man of his years and his fame were very tough to take. This was where he belonged. This was his magazine. And he'd hand in stuff, and then it would fall to me to say, I'm sorry, Jim, it didn't work out. And he lost it quite often on the phone when I would tell him this, and he would yell and scream and carry on and curse me and ask if I knew who he was, and I would say yes. And he did this with Sean too. He would curse Sean, and there were some vague threats behind this that he would get us, but never. No, that's wrong. He would never quite stated, but it was very unpleasant, very hard to deal with. But then he would write something else, and now and then we published something. But these were not good pieces. There was late in his life, and the ones that we did publish even don't hold up very well.
What were wrong with some of those later pieces?
He had nothing to write about. I mean, I think he wrote himself out fairly early in the overall scheme of things. But this was in the 50s, and he didn't have any new ideas. He wrote about parties. He wrote about tiny little quirks of behavior and tried to make them into casuals. And his casuals from the 30s, when he was turning out a stream of wonderful stuff, they were really light and cheerful and funny and inventive, and they were written in a minute. You could tell they were done quickly, and they held together, and there was something new. People hadn't written like this before. But this was, it was 30 years later, and he was near the end of his life. He was blind. It's hard, and it's not surprising it wasn't very good. I don't think Thurber had a whole lot to say late in his life, which is difficult. I mean, a lot of writers write themselves out, and I think particularly if you're writing short stuff, because each piece has to stand on its own, and you can't go back and do it over again. And it's done in a minute, and then next week you got to write something else.
You think it's particularly hard with humor to maintain that consistently?
It's very hard. It's hard to think of any humorist who's been funny over a long period of time. It's what is funny changes, and you change, and you don't feel funny all the time, and it's hard to produce that sparkling, easy little flow of things that makes people feel good, and it makes the writer feel good, and it makes the reader feel good. Very tough. And I don't think that we are. I mean, in this country, it's strange. We think of ourselves as being a nation that's very open to humor. We love humor. This is what we tell ourselves, and we love funny writers and comedians. But it's really not true. It's really not true. I think that we've never taken a funny politician seriously. I mean, Adlai Stevenson was funny, and look what happened to him. And I think that people who are funny are not considered quite reliable.
Suspicious of somebody who's not serious.
Yeah. Thurber had another problem too. In those hard days, he was obsessed with his own fame. He really thought about himself as he considered himself a very important writer. And when things didn't go his way, he would sometimes remind me who he was. He would say, do you know who I am? And I said, yes, Jim, I know who you are. And he would say, do you know that I've been called the most important American humorist since Mark Twain? He carried this around in his head, which is pathetic. And then he would told me more than once that he was the first and only American humorist who had been invited to lunch at the long table, whatever it was, at Punch magazine, a sign of something, a symbol of his greatness. And there's nothing to say if someone says this sort of thing to you. It's like pointing to your medals. It's really sad. It's interesting too that I think he loved going to England because they appreciated him, and they did think of him as that the mantle of Mark Twain had fallen on his shoulders, and they lionized him. And he'd love to give interviews and to sit down with literary figures or important people and be fawned on. this was the sort of stuff that Andy White couldn't stand. He would read about this and just shake his head and think that they'd lost him. They'd lost Jim Thurber because it just wasn't what writers should be doing. I think that there was a recent piece by Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker, which I think was a very sound piece about what happened to Thurber. Adam points out that he feels that World War II was an important mark of demarcation, that Jim didn't do much important after that, or didn't do much good writing after that, because he had nothing to do in the war, and that the war, which absorbed all our attentions at that time, either you were able to function in the war, and if you weren't, you were left behind in some way. And Jim had nothing to do during the war. Andy White, luckily, had moved to Maine, and he was always from away. He was a writer who lived in Maine, but he also had a whole separate life running a farm up there. And he had a lot of chickens during the war and was an air raid warden. But country life is something he took to naturally, and it gave him something to write about. And all his writings, his children's books and One Man's Meat and all the later writings of E.B. White were about his life in the country, which was ongoing and a very rich source of material for him. And Jim never found anything like that. And I think also that some other aspects of Jim's character showed late in his life. I mean, certainly his drinking was his character had changed. He'd become a mean drunk and a mean man when he wasn't drunk because of all the drinking he did. I think his misogyny, he really didn't like women, and I heard him say a couple of times, I can't remember quite when, but I heard him say very unpleasant and sort of lewd things about women, about what women were really for, which was as sexual objects. I remember one remark like that shocked me a little at the time, but mostly because it showed how much anger there was inside of him.
Do you remember how?
To change tapes again.
Yeah, I thought we could touch a little bit on that.
Do you have everything?
The following is Wild Sound from sound roll number 5.
Assumption. It wasn't an image. It wasn't for the rest of the world. It was for himself. He constantly said, every day, his attitude was, "I'm just a country boy from Boulder, Colorado. I don't know anything. So explain it to me." And this is a great attitude for an editor to have. Does the copy work? Does it say this? Is this are the assumptions here? Are they proper assumptions? Have I been told enough? And it was a crucial ingredient of the New Yorker, because the New Yorker, there's a strain of clear writing that went all the way through it that grew out of something like that, I believe.
No,
To change tape.
yeah, I think that's actually
It's a very blurred idea.
well, really, it's perhaps not great writing. I mean, because,
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully we all like to assume that someone might read it 100 years from now,
Yeah,
and
We'll just go again.
Montaigne, I suppose.
yeah,
Who knows who he was talking about?
Yeah.
but it's-
We are rolling again.
Yeah.
This was the background for all the famous questions that Ross would write on them. If you had something in print, in my case, I started off writing short stories, and it would come back and there would be 20 or 15 or 20 or 25 questions.